Jen udah masuk nih. Oke, halo, selamat malam teman-teman. Selamat malam GAMESEED friends semua. Oke, jadi malam ini kita bakal mulai sesi training ketiga kita bareng sama Jen Illyria, senior Google, sorry, senior growth manager dari Google, dan akan dimoderatori oleh Wafi as head of tech-nya AGT. Oke, biar nggak lama-lama dan teman-teman bisa langsung menikmati training hari ini, langsung aja kita mulai. Silakan Kang Wafi.
Oke, sip. Halo teman-teman. Halo Jen, welcome to the event. Thank you for your time here. Yeah, we are glad to have you here. Cup, can you pin Jen to the screen with me? Ya, bisa dipin nggak ya? Di mainnya, dari gimana? Oke. Ya, oke. So before I introduce Jen, maybe I want to talk a bit to everyone here. So today our transition is about the mobile game industry, mobile game metric. So the goal is that to everyone here to learn about what is mobile game metric, what kind of metric that is, and how we can use it, how we can measure it, and how can we use it to improve our game, right? So yeah, and I think different from the two previous session. Now we will have English session because Jen is from Google. So I think also in the previous training session we still have 10 more to go, and then we will have Indonesia and English depending on the speaker preferred language. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think please welcome to the session, Jen. Maybe you can introduce yourself a bit before we talk with the session.
We cannot hear you, Jen.
Oh yeah, Jen, you're still muted, I think.
Yeah.
All right, testing.
Okay.
Iya, kedengaran orangnya.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, cool. Sorry for that. Good to see everyone, and thank you, Wafi, for the introduction. My name is Jean, with the Google Ads team, based out of Singapore. Tapi aku dulu orang Indonesia. Tapi ini diminta sama Wafi dan tim untuk mencoba untuk berbahasa Indonesia hari ini, tapi agak karatan, jadi mohon maaf kalau sedikit gado-gado ya bahasanya ya. In the meantime, untuk hari ini aku bakal cover topik mengenai game metrics. Silahkan, ini bukan lecture. Silahkan gunakan fungsi chat ya mungkin ya Wafi ya, kalau ada pertanyaan atau ada komentar langsung aja. A little bit of a background before I get started. My name is Jean, with Google, based out of Singapore. This is probably my 7th year with Google, and most of that I spent working with game developers and game publishers across Southeast Asia. Dan sebelum join Google, I was with the Garena team in the Singapore office. Yeah, okay, cool. Now, I realized something, and this is a problem karena kita di Google nggak pakai ini ya, nggak pakai Zoom. I actually, oh, okay, I found it. Okay, give me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay. Nope, screen 1. Oke, tolong di-confirm kalau bisa kelihatan.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Awesome, perfect. Terima kasih konfirmasinya. So let's get started. Untuk hari ini kita bakal cover 5 poin. Yang pertama dimulai dengan introduction about the game life cycle. Kemudian masuk ke pre-launch phase, growth phase, maturity phase, dan metrik-metrik mana aja yang penting untuk di track and to pay attention to during these phases. And then lastly, we are also going to talk a little bit about Firebase and how that will be, that can help you essentially, get an insight, monitor, and act on it to improve the game metrics that we've covered before. Sebelum aku mulai, mungkin quick show of hands, siapa yang udah pernah dengar mengenai Firebase, siapa yang udah pernah launching game atau managing game development or product. Ya, langsung di chat
pakai ini
aja.
ya, pakai reaction ya.
Oke, agak sepi ya kayaknya ya, Wafi ya. Ini kayaknya perlu di ini.
Ada di itu, ada di reaction. Angkat tangan
Ada di
reaction.
Oke. Aku karena nggak pakai web, aku nggak pakai desktop client ya, aku pakai webnya.
Jadi nggak kelihatan ya?
Nggak kelihatan.
I see.
Nggak apa-apa. Thank you. Cool. Alright. Oke, aku lihat beberapa ada yang angkat tangan. A few people on chat as well. Thank you. So let's get started. So for today, kalau misalkan ada pertanyaan, like I said, please go straight ahead to the chat and ask. So starting off, never heard Firebase, sorry, no worries. Cool, so for the first part, the game life cycle itself. Now, the game life cycle is a framework, right? Jadi ini framework yang kita pakai untuk tim produk, tim marketing, developer, untuk memantau kira-kira game ini sudah ada, produk ini sudah ada di tahapan mana, dan apa yang harus jadi prioritas utama kita. Right. Biasanya kita bagi ini life cycle ke dalam 3 stage, 3 fase. Yang pertama mengenai pre-launch. Right. So in terms of pre-launch, the mission is to test and measure, right? Jadi kita harus memastikan bahwa game kita berjalan dengan lancar, feature-feature yang nggak ada yang bagi, dan kita tahu dan bisa track kira-kira user kita ngapain aja di dalam gamenya. Right. The second phase, growth, ini misinya untuk scale and accelerate. Jadi ini di mana kita fokusnya di user acquisition, fokusnya di making sure that we get money out of the games that we have developed. Dan yang terakhir juga untuk menjangkau user-user katakan di Indonesia, di luar negeri, dan di target-target market kita. Last phase, maturity. Nah, maturity ini ketika gamenya sudah cukup stabil. Jadi usually, probably in the third or fourth year, this is where the game will enter the maturity cycle. Di mana fokusnya adalah memastikan bukan no longer to get users into the game, but to ensure that the users who are already in the game, keep playing the game, retained in that particular game, and of course, also generate value for you as the developer. Now, what we do understand, dan ini aku mungkin bertanya kepada teman-teman sekalian, siapa yang udah pernah dengar konsep games as a service? Jadi game ini bukan cuma suatu produk lagi, tapi service yang kita render kepada user-user dan pemain-pemain kita. Okay, I see a few hands. Thanks for raising that. Jadi konsepnya adalah games as a service means that kita nggak cuma publish game, kemudian we forget about it, right? What we want to do here is to continuously provide content updates, continuously provide events, promotions, essentially making sure that the game remains a part of your player's life or lifestyle, and making sure that they continuously have new content and new stuff to look forward to. Now, this case, right, the initial maturity life cycle might look slightly different, kan? Karena kita, it's not just produce and leave it behind. We need to produce, we need to maintain it, we need to continuously update that, and that also means that we will continue having opportunities to bring in new users, new players with every update or every release that we have pushed out. Dulu kalau ada mungkin teman-teman yang pernah main game Ragnarok online, itu dulu it's my guilty pleasure back then ketika masih zaman SMP, and I'm revealing my age. But yeah, so that like MMOs, right? It's a good example of games as a service, right? And the metrics, right, that would also be different, and each of those metrics would have different priorities. And hopefully, we'll get a better understanding of that and how that moves across the cycle in the following slides. Cool. Now, before I get into the actual metrics, I also want to set context, right? Di mana kita sebagai game developer, we don't exist in a vacuum. And what that means is ada faktor-faktor di luar kontrol kita yang akan mempengaruhi tipe metrik apa yang harus kita perhatikan dan performa metrik-metrik itu seperti apa. Right. So for example, competition. Right, you're not the only game developer in the world. Di call ini aja udah ada, I probably count more than 20 easily, right? And these are your competitors, right? As much as they are your friends, they are also going to be your competitors. And you're not just looking at games as competition, right? Sebagai seorang user, kalian harus paham bahwa waktu kita terbatas. Right? Jadi mungkin ada hari ini aku punya 2 jam kosong yang aku nggak kerja, nggak ada PR, nggak perlu melakukan kerjaan rumah tangga and so on. And how am I going to spend those 2 hours? Am I going to pick up my phone and start playing games? Am I going to turn on my computer and start playing games? Am I going to watch a movie instead? Am I going out? Am I singing karaoke and so on? So there is that consideration, right? And there is also the marketing side of things, right? What that means is you need to be aware that for a game to be successful, it's not enough to just build a good product, right? Just building a great game is unfortunately no longer sufficient, right? You need to be able to promote and market the game to your potential users. Like people need to know that this game exists, and people need to be convinced that this is a good use of their time. Right? And then all this, right, the competition, the marketing factor, of course, the user behaviors and so on, should factor into the game development process. And that is, I guess, our jobs as developers to ensure that we don't forget about that. Now, translating, right, or rather, just going back to the life cycle earlier, we have our mission earlier, and sekarang kita lihat objektifnya apa untuk setiap life cycle stage ini. Right, like I mentioned earlier, for pre-launch, the mission was to, actually aku lupa. The mission was to test and measure, right? And in terms of objectives, that means that we need to look at number of pre-registrations, number of beta testers that we're able to get, initial interest levels in the game, as well as potential user retention in the game itself once we've started. Right. This is where we test our stability. This is where we do our stress testing and so on. In terms of growth, objectives include number of installs, number of active users, and then in terms of maturity, the objectives would look at, like I mentioned earlier, revenue, return on investments, essentially, and how valuable your overall users are. Now, going into each of these phases in depth, let's start with the pre-launch phase. What, and I'll ask this to the floor. What is your understanding of a pre-launch phase? Biasanya apa aja yang terlibat di dalam fase ini?
Mungkin teman-teman ada yang mau jawab atau mau jawabin?
Can I?
Teman-teman.
Ya, boleh.
So in my understanding, I guess the pre-launch phase is the phase, of course, we develop the game, but at this phase, we need to start to test the game, test the core mechanic, not only internal testing.
Konteksnya teman-teman ini ada yang udah.
But maybe we also need to be able to attract the beta tester to test our game before the launch itself, I guess.
Okay, great. Sorry, Wafi, I think you had something earlier. I think so. Yeah, I think it's a bit laggy. No worries. Cool. Okay. So, like Calvin dari Kumagima said, it is, we need to test the game and we need to attract beta testers. That is a correct understanding. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? In the sense that, the game does not have to officially launch into beta. It does not have to. This could as simple, this phase could be as simple as letting your other colleagues play the game, going through that QA phase internally, sending it to a couple of your close friends to see if it works, right? That is the initial phase, right? And then, of course, if you'd like to test the game a little bit more rigorously, then that is when we enter the the official pre-launch phase, by using actual people you don't know, actual players to test the game and so on. Now the challenge here is that when we develop a game, right, kita kadang-kadang nggak tahu juga the features that we love the most. Right? Jadi di sini goalnya adalah untuk essentially understanding whether your main features are what your gamers are attracted to, and how many of these testers that you have are able to provide ideas and feedback about future product development directions, right? So this is essentially stress test untuk tim developer dan tim product untuk arahan ke depannya seperti apa dari sisi produk. Now, what are some of the key metrics, right? We've briefly talked about this earlier. Retention, session time, install rate, crash rates, latency. There's a lot, and hopefully this captures some of that, right? And I'll keep going back to this slide or this slide format in the future. Jadi untuk pre-launch phase, we focus on stability and usability, right? Ini kita, so some of the things that would be important for us to look at is starting from the blue boxes. These are your tech specs, right? Jadi in terms of APK size, seperti apa, permission apa aja kalau kita di, if you're talking about Android or iOS apps and games, right? What sort of permissions does the game require? How does the UI and UX look like? Right, so these are some of the considerations, and then of course we can also add in our analytics tools and monitoring tools here as well as part of that. Now this would also this would also be affected by things like reviews, right, of your product. Jadi kalau misalkan ada beberapa studio di sini yang sebelumnya sudah pernah launching game, bakal ada ekspektasi atau bakal ada questions essentially around how similar or how different will your next game be, right? There will also be a question about awareness again, bagaimana cara kita mendapatkan user ke game baru kita ini. There will be questions around community. Jadi kalau misalkan kita pre-launching, apakah kita sudah bisa mulai membangun komunitas di around our game, right? I think banyak game-game di luar sana yang sebelum mereka launch, they invite testers and so on onto a forum, onto Discord, any social platform essentially, to start interacting and to share those teasers, right? And then any of the events that are active as well. Now, all of this, right, from your tech specs, from these influencer factors, would affect your game metrics, primarily through your install rates. Right? And your install rates are, or your adoption rate essentially, is your one of the key metrics that you should look at here. Right. This would also continue not just on the pre-launch phase, but also throughout the rest of the phases as we grow. Now, beyond install rates, we should also look at retention as well as session length to give you an indicator of how healthy the game is. Now, looking at retention and session length, right? These are in turn affected by a couple of different things, which we refer to as your app or your game vitals. Right? And by vitals, we mean how often does your game crash? How many bugs are there, right? What is the ANR rate? ANR here refers to Android not responding, right? Basically, means that it crashes without an official description or with an official description, as well as the latency in your game, right? Latency, not just in terms of internet connection, but also in terms of whether or not the game responds quickly, whether it loads too long, and so on. Now, I realized I went into this going straight into Android metrics. Boleh tahu mungkin teman-teman ini are you more familiar with Android, iOS, or are you making a desktop game essentially?
Kalau ini mungkin semuanya buat mobile game ya. Kita emang spesifikkan harusnya buat Android dulu ya.
Got it. Thank you for the context, Wafi. In that case, I am happy because the slides work. Yeah. So, quick question to the floor again. How many of you have heard about these terms, and how many of you have just seen this for the first time? And if so, which ones are the new terms that come into your vocabulary today?
I'm quite familiar with it.
Quite familiar? Okay, awesome.
Mungkin teman-teman yang lain ada yang baru tahu gitu, mungkin boleh angkat tangan juga. Silakan yang baru dengar ini. Beberapa saya.
Seen it before, but never applied it. Okay,
ya,
thank you, Andre Dana.
Baca tapi belum paham gitu ya.
What is ANR? Okay, so good question. ANR rate is sama pernah dengar tapi belum ngerti. Oke. Oke, jadi ANR rate itu mirip dengan istilah crash rate. Tapi perbedaannya adalah kalau crash, usually the app just closes, right? It is an error essentially that forces your game to terminate the process, right? Whereas for ANR, Android not responding, this means that the error or the bug in your game has caused your user's entire device to usually freeze, right? Or the game itself has frozen and it does not automatically terminate itself. Yeah. Cool. Tadi yang dari Vindi, sama pernah dengar tapi belum ngerti. Any understood?
Mungkin ini Jen mungkin bisa di retention mungkin ya, kan teman-teman mungkin ini ada yang udah pernah, ada yang benar-benar baru ya, jadi mungkin boleh sedikit kali ya.
Cool. So retention refers to how many, or it is usually a percentage, right? Nah, retention ini adalah gambaran berapa persentase user-user yang kalian punya di aplikasi ini, game ini, yang akan continuously menggunakan game ini, right? Jadi contohnya misalkan Wafi install hari ini, apakah besok Wafi akan main gamenya lagi? Right. So that is what we want to look at. And also within each of those sessions, how long is Wafi going to, that's essentially session length, right? Seberapa lama Wafi akan menghabiskan waktu di dalam aplikasinya. Right? So that's what we are looking at. And the reason why this is important is because this is a very strong signal of whether or not your game is exciting enough, right? Jadi, so a longer session length typically is a good thing, right? Karena that means that the user is invested, engaged during that time. However, a session length that is very long, coupled with a low retention rate, might not necessarily be a good thing, because what that means is that the users burns through content faster than the game is able to provide that, right? That is one of the indications, right? Jadi karena itu, what we want to ensure is a balance between these, right? A high enough session length to, of course, indicate that the user has done all that the user can or should do within the session without burning themselves out or burning the content through. We want the user to continue coming back until either the game is finished, a speed run. Yes, Rafi. Yeah. So either the user comes back to play more, or they continue and get absorbed essentially into the cycle. Dan ini bukan jadi sebuah game aja, tapi menjadi sebuah habit, right? Di mana setiap hari mungkin bangun tidur, mereka akan log in, menghabiskan energinya, and then go on about their lives. So that's what we want, right? There is a question dari Budi. Is there a number we can use as a benchmark in general, or data that we can use in terms of retention? So that is a good question. There are benchmarks, of course, but it all ultimately depends on the kind of game that you run, right? And by that, I mean hardcore games, contohnya, your MMORPGs and so on, they tend to have a higher retention rate as opposed to casual or even hyper casual games for which the retention rates tend to be lower, right? I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I believe the average retention globally for games is around day one retention rates, right? Around 40%, right? That is for the top 10th percentile of games, right? But again, these numbers change, and the retention rates have been dropping across the years. Again, as more and more competition comes up, users get more choices and so on. So my recommendation here is to benchmark this against your own games if you have them, or otherwise try to look at games within a very similar category and gameplay cycle that you have. Right. Ada juga pertanyaan dari Vindi sebelumnya, kegunaan dan aplikasi dari metrik-metrik ini. So, like I mentioned earlier, the vitals ini kalian bisa lihat langsung di dashboard Play Store kalian, right? That will have a report there. And what this and how you use this, right, is essentially you try to minimize all three numbers here. Definitely try to minimize the crash rates, ANR rates, and latency, and also try to identify which areas or which flows within your game actually trigger the most of these warnings or errors, right? And then focus your development efforts there. In terms of APK size and permissions, that brings me to my next slide. There we go. So Indonesia, there is a very strong correlation between the size of the game and the install rates that you're getting, right? And this also affects the uninstall rate, meaning seberapa cepat user ini akan menguninstall game ini. So in a way, retention rates as well. Now, alasannya kenapa? Karena a lot of the devices in Indonesia have very limited memory. Jadi we see a lot of patterns where users only keep 1 or 2 games on their devices at any given time, right? Which means that ketika game kalian, when it's no longer as interesting, or if the size is too large, it will be number 1 on their priority list to get uninstalled, to make space for other things, be that other apps, other games, more photos, more videos, and so on. On average, we see a drop in install rates of about 1% for every 6 megabytes increase in APK size. So this is one area of optimization. Of course, number 1, design a great game. But number 2, always keep in mind that you should attempt to limit the APK size, be that by being efficient in terms of your asset usage, in terms of your scripting, as well as in terms of the number of add-on third-party APKs that you put into the app, into the game, right? Now, moving into some of the other parts, ratings and reviews, right? Of course, these affect how, these would affect your game's install rate, but also for the developer, this is a very good source of information in terms of, what features are happening, what users think about the apps, the game's speed, the game's design, and overall usability, as well as how stable or how buggy it is. Right. So do keep a lookout on this. Usually, any game-breaking bugs or device freezing bugs would result in a 1-star review. And on the opposite spectrum, games that appear to be faster, more responsive, or have very good UI UX tend to give you a higher rating. Right, so do keep that in mind. These stats are available on the Google Play Store on the console, so do keep a lookout and act on them accordingly. Right. So if the ANR rates earlier give you a number, the reviews and the ratings should give you context as to what impact those ANR rates and those crashes have on the game and the user experience. Now, those are earlier some, like I highlighted ANR rate and crash rates. Of course, there is quite a bit more to look at in terms of vitals. Jadi keep in mind battery usage, keep in mind app stability, render time, the launch loading times when you start the game, and whether it is right after you booted up the device or after you've closed the game and reopened it again, and so on, as well as permissions, which we covered earlier. Right. Now, any questions so far? Aku bakal pause maybe for a few minutes to see if there are questions.
So can I?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we go back to the slide where you show the stability and bug speed design usability? So
yep.
There is an option in the Play console where the developer can upload the game as an early access. So my question is that, does the game with early access can also get this data from the user? Because what I've seen is the user cannot give a rating or comments to the game that is in the early access development.
Right, you're right. So for early access games, this is not available on the Play Store, right? What I was referring to here is, ratings and reviews. Okay, I think it depends on how we define that pre-launch stage, right? Is it, do you exit this stage or do you stop caring essentially about these metrics after you leave the pre-launch phase, or after you leave early access, or do you have that period where you continue monitoring these metrics? Early user reviews, for example, tend to be a useful tool for this. There is also the option for you to direct your users or your early testers towards a bug reporting page, for example, where they can give more context to the errors. Right? This is one of the channels where you can see the feedback that the users are giving. And there's always more channels where we can get this from. Hopefully that clarifies that, Calvin. Cool. There's a question from Angkasa Prahara. What is the cause for APK size increase in the game? Oversized assets, models with too much nodes, inefficient script? The answer is yes to all of those, right? One thing to note, for example, is, dan ini yang lumayan sering kita lihat adalah assets, right? You mentioned it there, oversized assets. There is this tendency, of course, as a designer to create assets that are high definition, right? A lot of some of my gaming clients, for example, used to create assets in Blender, in 3D, and render it at full resolution for use in the game. However, when we look at the game itself, these assets they appear as much smaller models in reference to the larger, game playable character, context, level setting, and so on. So be very efficient in terms of where or what we render, with what resolution and what pixel density and so on, or what what number of polygons and such. And focus those on the elements or the assets that are actually on the foreground most of the time. So your character models, for example, key interactable elements within the game, right? Whereas for other things like background textures and such, you can always choose to reduce the number of polygons for those, and or even maybe reuse some existing assets across different parts of the game, and just reskinning or recoloring those, as opposed to creating an entirely new model itself, right? So that's assets, right? Other than that, like you mentioned, inefficient scripts. Yes, definitely. There are multiple ways where we can run a script, write a script that does the same thing in 100 lines versus in, let's say, 20 lines, right? Every single bit counts. Of course, when talking about scripts, there are limitations, but yes, those count as well. Is this a good way to provide internal download than original size download on store to increase the install rate? Right, so this is a good question. Then I'll rephrase this a bit, Lesman. Jadi pertanyaannya adalah, apakah kita, what is the best practice, right? Should we get users to download a very small installer and then get users to download additional assets after they have downloaded the initial installer from the Play Store? Yes and no. In the sense that users may feel, right, doing this, right, might make users feel cheated somehow, right? Aku dulu suka main Genshin Impact on my mobile phone. Download dari Play Store, oh, it's pretty small, 200 megabyte. And then the assets are like, 9 gigabytes on its own. So do this at your own risk, I would say. One thing to consider again is the length of the launch time, right? Jadi kita kembali ke metric ini tadi. What is the app startup time, right? The app startup time here, of course, as a hard metric refers to how long it takes to launch the game. But from a user perspective, right, this loading and downloading of assets is counted as an app startup time in their minds, right? So always keep that in mind. You don't want this to be overly long, especially during the first playthrough. What some games have done relatively well, terutama kalau ada progression dari level 1 ke level 10, ke level 20, 30, for example, is to only download assets when those become necessary for use in the upcoming levels. Jadi they don't download everything at once at the start. Sometimes there are ways for you to run those, download those assets after a user has completed a certain level or stage and is preparing for the next launch. Is the APK like Genshin also need to be small? This is a good, well, I mean, I think it's the same question to the previous few that we've been discussing. The smaller the size, the better, right? It doesn't mean that the game needs to be small, but we have to be, we have to remember whom the game is intended for. Genshin obviously targets higher end devices, right? Based on the graphic requirements, based on the even the monetization model of the game, right? Their primary audience is users with high-end devices who can spend on the gacha. So it depends again. Kalau game kalian bergantung pada user volume to generate things like ad revenue, for example, or tiny microtransactions that are a few cents in value, then it is much more a volume game than a quote unquote quality game. And in that sense, APK size becomes an even more critical element. So keep in mind who the game is for, and then design it for that.
Ini dari aku mau nambahin dikit. Jadi kita akan ada sesi training buat teman-teman ya. Nanti kita akan ada sesi training tentang bagaimana mengupdate konten, akan dibahas oleh CTO dari Gambir itu harusnya lebih teknikal ya. Jadi kalau teman-teman nanti tanya gimana cara update-nya biar lebih kecil gitu-gitu, nanti mungkin saya tanya di sana. Kalau ini mungkin kita bisa fokus more on the metric side lah ya, gitu ya. Mungkin gitu ya. Nanti silakan ada training berikutnya.
Perfect.
Silakan.
Thank you. Cool. Thanks you for that, Wafi. Now let's move on, I guess. So growth phase, and welcome to the second phase here. So growth phase is split into two different, I would say, sub phases, right? The first is the launch, and then the second is the acceleration phase, right? The launch phase itself, I think, pretty straightforward. This is your biggest opportunity to get users and to start monetizing your game. And the reason for that is because we noticed that games tend to be a lot more discoverable, and users are a lot more open to downloading games when they are newer. So games that have been in the market for about a year, 2 years, and 3 years, there is a very significant drop in the discoverability rate, as well as the number of new users coming in, and even through paid means, so not just organic. Right? And the reason for that is because there is a preconception that when a game is new, users tend to be a lot more excited, right? By, of course, the possibilities, the prospects, and as one of the main drivers of game usage, there is a stronger chance for them to be number one. Right. And the Google Play algorithm, I would say, also leverages on this, right? It does promote newer games or games that have just entered the Play Store more aggressively than games that have been in the market for longer. Right. So the focus in this area is to acquire and activate as many new users as possible, right? And to do that, of course, increasing number of active users, getting the right message, and continuously updating your product, your game, to bring in new content and to let users know that this is a game that is active, that has a lot of users, and that is popular amongst our friends and so on. Right. So key metrics, going back to this lovely and very confusing slide. We are looking at a few things, right? So in terms of the key game metrics that we want to pay attention to, number of installs that we've mentioned earlier, retention still stays critical. It's still a key component here. But beyond that, we also want to look at session length, as well as a North Star metric, your DAU and MAUs. Now, DAU and MAUs refers to your daily active users and monthly active users. Some developers go one step further and look at peak concurrent users, right? And peak concurrent users is typically a metric that is more relevant for games that are multiplayer in nature, that requires matching or a social element to make it more appealing to all the other users. Right. Now, these are influenced by, again, a couple of different things. The events that you run, the community that you have, the promotions that you run, the rankings, ratings, and reviews that we mentioned earlier. And then from a marketing perspective that we discussed, creatives, how you're promoting that game, your budget, the number of channels that you use, and the onboarding strategy that you have for the users. Now, these in turn translate into ad metrics. So if you're using paid user acquisition as opposed to just purely organic, things like your frequency, your reach, the target, and your actual CPIs or cost per acquisitions would matter as well. But again, for the game itself, these are the key. And of course, during this phase, do continue monitoring the same metrics that we've covered earlier, right? Your ANRs, your crash rates, and such. One area here to test, especially if you're designing a multiplayer game, right, is the stress testing. How many concurrent users is your game able to support? How long is the matchmaking, if there is one? And in terms of the more game specific, I would say, metrics, also look at level progression, right? How fast users are burning through your content, like we briefly touched on earlier, as well as how many, how much assets each user has accumulated. Right. I think my colleague from the play team will be elaborating slightly more on the asset flow concept within the game. But this is essentially useful for when you are looking at games that monetize through in-app purchases, right, where you need to constantly monitor your users' wallet sizes, how much credit they have essentially in their system, how much they're spending, and what they are spending it on. Right. I'll pause again. Okay, no questions. Cool, perfect. Okay, moving on. So when we are looking at the growth phase, again, like I mentioned, DAU and MAU is your North Star, right? However, what feeds into this is your installs and your retention. And if you look at these, we'll realize that we get another metric derived from this, and that is first day engagement metrics, essentially session lengths and user activity within the first day or even the first hour since they've downloaded the game. Now, the reason why this is important is because as users, when we first install a new game or a new app, we are in an exploratory mode. And that means that we look at, we are looking for things that we like, and we are looking out also for things that we dislike before we decide whether or not to invest more time into this particular game or to continue using this game, right? Now, what we see is that users who spend a longer time, a longer session length on their first day are more likely to return in the subsequent days, right? That means your game, from a developer perspective, should optimize towards retaining users for as long as possible during the first day. And during that time, focus on giving them those hooks, right? So if you're looking at, jadi contoh lagi, Genshin, right? When you first join the game and start the game, what are you given? What are the developers giving you? Right? You get credits in game for free that you can use to pull for characters. Right? They give you a number of quests. They give you a story background. They give you that setting, that context. They'll give you some equipment, or even some games let you be very powerful during before they put you into the actual game, right? The real world, so to say. And there is a reason for that. And that reason is this, right? Developers want to get you hooked in the first day so that you continue coming back for more. Right? And the same concept applies to other kinds of games, right? It applies for, even puzzle games, right? Puzzle games tend to start relatively easy, but not too easy. They would actually start somewhere around the, if scale 1 is the hardest, scale 1 is the easiest, scale 10 is the hardest. Puzzle games tend to start you around level 3 or 4, right? Not too easy and not too hard. And then sometimes from 3 or 4, it might go down back to 1 or 2 before climbing back up to 10 in terms of difficulty. And the reason is the same, right? They want to provide you with enough of a challenge to keep coming back for more. So as a key metric to look out on, during the launch phase, or even during the pre-registration and pre-testing phase, right? Look at the time spent during the first day in the game. The higher you can get this, the more likely the users are going to retain. Now, I do have a few slides on how to utilize paid acquisition campaigns to help you grow during this phase. But before I get into that, question to the floor: how many of you have previously, actually, how many of you have a game live at the moment?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
It's still in the pre-registered phase.
Jadi konteksnya ini lagi kompetisi, lagi fase inkubasi. Jadi kita setelah ini harusnya mereka akan launching di grand final gitu. Jadi ini lagi prepping up para beginner developer gitu.
Okay. We are beginners. No worries. It's always good to work with folks just starting out. It's amazing to see the progression and the evolution, right, that we see. Cool. So in that sense, I guess I will reserve the marketing side of things for later in the curriculum. I think I have another session with you folks on that, and I'll reserve that for then, right? Okay, how to track the first day session in minutes? Is it automatically tracked by Firebase? Yes, the answer to that is yes. If you have Firebase as an analytics tool, we would automatically start capturing session lengths, right? And you can then filter that report of first open, meaning the time the user first, opened the app and started using it. So you can filter and actually see that metric on Firebase, as well as I think most of the other like game analytics platforms would offer the same. Right? It is a very critical metric to look at, and yes, we do support that. Cool. I know we are. Yes, just filter the data. That is right. I know we are almost at time, so I'm going to go through the maturity phase first before I continue taking questions. Cool. So for the maturity phase, like I mentioned earlier, this is when new user acquisition starts to slow down and your returning users become your primary focus. The challenge here again is in ensuring sustainability and increasing your user value. So I guess the question to the developers here is, how are you defining user value, right? How have you, for example, started thinking about monetization and what sort of revenue monetization model you are going to use in the game, right? Jadi untuk contoh mungkin ada Jeffrey, I see. I see Jeffrey. I was about to use Agate as an example, but since Jeffrey is here, let's maybe use something else. No. So for example, right, when you're designing a simple match 3 game, right, how are you monetizing that content? Right? Are you looking at ads, for example, with an energy system perhaps to help you refill that, or to help you, give additional moves? Are you looking at in-app purchases perhaps to give users a chance to skin the game or to buy power-ups that would help them solve their puzzles? Or are you going with a, maybe even a subscription model, right, where users need to pay a certain amount every month to continue playing the game? Or is it a premium model where users pay one time to install and then keep the game for life? So a lot of questions here. What we recommend is, of course, to tailor the monetization options here according to the, the target market that you're looking at, right? It's not necessary, and in fact, it's not recommended to use everything all at once. But do keep in mind that ideally, your game should be a source of, somewhat a source of revenue, so that you can continue reinvesting that and creating further games. I think that is one of the key challenges that a lot of early game developers face, where the focus sometimes is in creating great games, not so much in terms of how those games can generate value for the developers. Cool. So in terms of metrics, going back to my favorite chart model, it's money, right? Maturity phase is usually retention again, but beyond retention, retention feeds into revenue, right? And what we are looking here in terms of the primary game metrics are revenue figures, cost figures, as well as the return on investment and users' lifetime value. Now, for cost, of course, there are these four major cost centers in terms of your operations. If it is, if you need a team of engineers and developers to maintain the game, if you need to run live services in terms of server costs, in terms of, just community management, that goes under operations. Marketing, obviously, for user acquisitions and engagement. Development fees, if you are, for example, paying licenses or need to pay your developers, which I hope you do. And just general overheads in terms of your rent, your office space, and such. What feeds into revenue, in the other hand, is your daily active user numbers, because there can be no revenue without users. And beyond that, your average revenue per daily active users, right? And this, in turn, of course, depends on the pricing that you've set, the promotions that you've set, and your DAU depends on the overall user experience, right? Now that feeds into revenue. And then from revenue, if you balance that with cost, you get your return on investments, pretty straightforward. But in terms of LTV, right, this is your user lifetime value. And this should be the key metric that you look at when you are at this phase. And the reason for this is you want to be sure about how much a user is able to bring you in terms of dollar amounts, for you to be able to continue bringing new users in, right? And essentially that game, milking that game until till the very end, essentially. I will again skip the marketing part, but right, the monetization models that I spoke about earlier, we have those premiums, in-app purchases, subscriptions, as well as ads. Let me know if there are questions here, but otherwise I will keep going before we go into the next section. No questions. All right, perfect. Okay. Now, I know I did speak about key primary metrics on each of these phases. This in no way means that the previous things that we covered become irrelevant, right? They are still relevant, and the reason why we call this phases and not like segments is because each phase builds upon the previous one, right? As you see here, DAU is critical to generate revenue and revenue into lifetime value. And DAU is the focus during the growth phase, right? So we always keep coming back to what we've been testing for before. And your DAU, for example, is not going to be there without a decent, decently low crash rate and ANR rate. So that's what we're looking for. Now, in terms of Firebase, right? There was a question earlier on whether or not data would be available on Firebase and so on. We'll cover that in the next section. Next session, right? But for today, just a quick overview, right? Firebase essentially covers three different value propositions, I would say. Of course, number one, in terms of user acquisition, that is where I think Firebase helps quite a bit. But beyond that, analytics, this is your primary concern. We do track the basic metrics like installs, session starts, uninstall rates, as well as things like in-app purchases and revenue. And you can also create your custom events. So you can set, for example, where set Firebase to track when users start making payments, when they reach a certain level, when they do a certain action. You can always customize these as events within the game, or any button that they click, for example, to track, to get a full picture of the user journey. right? We also have game performance reports in terms of, to help you with your technical readiness. That also allows you to run A/B testing, for example, of certain features that you've developed or certain presentations of those features within the game. Each of these, again, get a lot more elaborate as you go through the phases. Yeah, I guess that's that. I know we are at time. Wafi, quick question here on whether it's okay to get your help to share perhaps these content with the folks here.
Of course. Ya, jadi nanti mungkin buat teman-teman, nanti semua slide ini akan dibantu sama panitia ya. Kita cara buat bisa di-download. Tapi mungkin kita hari ini topiknya ini dulu, topik kedua sama Jen lagi harusnya. Bakal ngebahas lebih in-depth tentang Firebase. Sengaja bikin 2 sesi, karena nggak mungkin 1 sesi ya. Maksudnya, teman-teman nanti buat pertanyaan yang lebih detail tentang gimana pakai Firebase, gimana baca datanya, itu harusnya nanti bisa dibahas di sesi berikutnya. Jadi ini harusnya masih semacam panjang
ini
gitu
teaser
ya.
aja untuk sesi berikutnya gitu ya.
Oke. Tapi kalau misalkan ada teman-teman yang masih mau nanya terkait dengan tadi kontennya tadi ya tentang face ini juga boleh, silakan
Yeah,
di sini.
I can stay over for another 5 to 10 minutes, so happy to take questions.
Ya, oke. Kita lagi kedatangan yang rare nih dari Google, Jen ya. Jadi silakan dimanfaatkan waktunya gitu ya. Ini nanti kita udah lewat 2 menit ya.
Promosinya mantap nih.
Mungkin yang uniknya jadi Jen, dia bisa bahasa Indonesia. Jadi kalian bisa tanya pakai Indonesia juga masih bisa. Kalau yang lain
ya,
mungkin
boleh.
Berapa dari Google bukan dari Indonesia ya?
Dari Google Indonesia. No, but pertanyaan kalau mau pakai bahasa Indonesia silahkan. Aku bisa mengerti. It's just when I say stuff, my brain tends to go faster than my mouth. So that's why I refer to English.
Hey, Jen, could you please go back to the slide number 3?
Slide number 3. Is that on the entire presentation?
Yes, I guess.
This?
The next slide. Yes, this one.
Okay.
What do you mean here by activation? Could you elaborate more about this?
Sure. So again, this depends on your internal definition, but from based on my experience, right? Acquisition is different from activation in the sense that acquisition refers to users who install, right? Activation means users who are quote unquote hooked in the game, right? So going past that action or that set of actions that really shows how high their potential for retention and for purchase and for conversion is. Ini istilahnya kalau pakai bahasanya Facebook, aha moment, right? Jadi dulu waktu Facebook launching pertama kali, acquisition is easy, right? They have millions of users. Tapi yang mereka peduli itu bukan jumlah installnya, so it's not just acquisition. They are looking at how many of those users who have installed actually get, I think it was 10 friends within 7 days. Because once you get 10 friends within 7 days, they are much more likely to continue using Facebook. Right? So that is what activation refers to here.
And another questions?
Yeah.
Let's say a user install our game on the first day, and then they don't like it and they uninstall it.
Yeah.
But next month, let's say we make a special event, and then he came back to the game, then he reinstalled the game. So does that count as retention or a new install?
That is a good question, right? So there is a separate term for that, actually. And developers call this a lot of different things. Back in Garena, I think we used to call them resurrected users. But the official term, or rather the more commonly used term for that is users. Right? It's neither retained, it's not a new install. But so important thing to note here is, and thank you for the question, Calvin, is when we talk about retention, when we talk about conversions, we usually talk about these in a specific window, time window, right? So what we don't just say, okay, what's your game retention, right? Earlier, there was a question, what is the benchmark for retention? There is no overall benchmark for retention, right? It is always in reference to a specific time period. So what is your 1 day retention? What is your 7 day retention? What is your 10, 14, 30, 90-day retention rates? And what that means is 90-day retention, for example, refers to users who come back within 90 days of their last session.
But the game is still installed in their devices.
Not necessarily,
Not
right?
necessarily.
So some users, like you said, might uninstall and then reinstall it next month, which is within that 90-day window. So in that sense, they are counted as a 90-day retained user. Hopefully that answers the question.
And does Firebase, have that feature, to detect like 90 days retention and so on and so forth?
Yes. So Firebase does have a cohort report. Again, we'll cover this in more depth next session. We do have a cohort report that allows you to look at, mentioned certain time periods and where, what stats they have for each of these periods.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Yeah. Does it count if the user is a free player? Yes. So all users are, I wanted to say all users are created equal, but the truth is it's not. So it really depends, right? What do you care about? So some companies, they purely look at, or rather they call, paying users and free users different things, right? So retained users, they would split that metric into two: free retained users and retained paying users, essentially, right? It is the same concept. It is just how you call and how you filter and slice that data. Typically, of course, you want your paying retention rate to be higher than your free retention rate. But yes, all users are counted in the metrics, but the weightage that you place on each of these users would be different based on their value. For example, whether or not they pay. From my experience, resurrected users, do they occur often enough? Can you share estimated number of percentage? No, I cannot share a percentage number. It is typically, from my experience, not very high, definitely less than 10%. But with that in mind, right, it really depends again on your game and how, what the update cycle is like. Right? Again, going back to the Genshin example, a lot of users tend to return whenever a new character is released. Right. So in that sense, yes, there is a significant chunk of resurrected users. Whether or not this is a good thing, you'll need to look at that in context, right? Do these users only come back during new launches and then not stay? Because if that is the case, then it is an issue, right? So the percentage of resurrected users itself or returning users itself is not necessarily a critical metric. What you want to look at is, as a cohort, as a group, what do these users do after they come back? Got it. Might I ask what or how to optimize a game? Oversized assets. You need to be the exact size from game designer.
Nah, mungkin ini buat ini nanti ya di sesi lain ya. Nanti sorry ya buat angkasa ya. Nanti kita akan ada sesi juga sama CTO yang lebih teknikal. Mungkin bisa sana. Soalnya udah off time. Sorry.
Thanks for rescuing me, Wafi. I was about to say I am not a game designer.
Iya. Dan lebih ke data ya, lebih ke sesi. Oke, thank you Jen buat waktunya, juga mungkin thank you buat teman-teman nih, sangat antusias ya sesinya. Semoga berfaedah ilmunya nih, dan mungkin Jen bakal mengisi 3 sesi harusnya ke depannya ya. Jadi mungkin kita kasih
you'll see me again. Whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know, but you'll see me again 2 more times.
Looking forward to your session, Jen.
Thank you, folks. Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. And thank you, Wafi, for hosting.
Ya. Oke, nanti mungkin buat teman-teman nanti jangan lupa buat sesi berikutnya mungkin aku balikin lagi ke Yusuf. Sebelumnya mungkin kita kasih applause dulu buat Jan ya, yang udah ngeluangin waktunya buat kita semua di sini. Ya, thank you.
Thank you,
thank you folks for being very engaged. I love it.
Okay, such a great session. buat friendship semua. Besok akan ada training session yang keempat bareng sama Erna Chai, Creative Lead of Allegrium. Topiknya besok adalah Designing an Intuitive UI and UX Design. Semoga training session hari ini bermanfaat buat teman-teman dan see you besok. Dadah.
Makasih Mas Wafi, makasih Yusuf. Bye semua.
Yo.
Thank you.